Hello and welcome to the first ever live performance, though that word's doing a lot of work, of We Have Ways of Making You Talk. For those of you who think you've stumbled into some sort of unstructured barroom chat between two World War history nerds, I congratulate you on your powers of perception. However, this is actually a podcast featuring the brilliant historian, Mr. James Holland, and me, I'm a fisherman in the great sea of life, Al Murray. This is how it works. People ask us questions about World War II. We try and answer them. On occasions, we have been known to ramble off on outrageous tangents. I hope you'll forgive us. James.
Yes, hello, and welcome to all of you at the Saturday of the Chalke Valley History Festival. Yay! So yes, we'll be taking your questions shortly, but first we've got some observations and corrections from our regular listeners that we need to discuss and address, don't we, Al?
Okay, yes. So, first of all, Mark Roberts writes to us, and if you like the sound of this question, give it an anticipatory ooh, right? Yeah. And I may come to one of you and say, what do you think of this? Because, James and I, we're not definitive. You know what you're talking about.
Not really. I mean, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't.
Okay. After reading Leo McKinstry's excellent Operation Sea Lion, I wondered if the war could potentially have been shorter had the Germans decided to invade England in 1940. Given their lack of prep, it seems it would have been a disaster. James, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with him. I do think it would have been a complete disaster. I mean, it's bonkers what they were doing. I mean, just think about the preparation for Operation Sea Lion. So to start off with, Hitler has got the first combined services general staff, the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which is inherently a good idea.
Yep.
But he doesn't use it in that way. So what happens is they defeat France, everyone goes, hooray, the war's over, back in Germany. Hitler does a triumph, I think, on the 7th of July, something like that. Yep. Goes into Berlin, the swastikas are out, 250,000 lining the streets, everyone telling him what a hero he is. He feels really great about himself. He then goes to his Alpine retreat, the Berghof, on the Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden,
yep,
in the Bavarian Alps. And there he hangs out till, I think, the Beirut Wagner Festival in the 3rd week of July.
Yep.
And what he does, he goes, right, so what are we going to do next then? And everyone goes, well, I'm pretty confident, mein Führer, that the British are going to sue for peace. And he goes, OK, plan B. Let's hear what the Navy have got to say. And the Navy turn up and they go, well, mein Führer, what we're thinking about is...
it's like being in the room with them, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, because my accents are so good.
It's so strong.
Yeah. OK, I can try if you like.
No, there's really no need.
No, OK, thank you. Let me off that hook. So anyway, so they come in and they go, well, mein Führer, what we're thinking of is a really narrow invasion, sort of a round deal at the shortest part of the channel, because we haven't really got much shipping, and otherwise, we can't do a big broad front invasion. And he goes, OK, yeah, fine. Well, go off the planet. Then the army come in and he says, so what's your plan? He goes, well, mein Führer, what we're thinking of doing is on a broad front from Lyme Regis in a place called Dorset, and then we'll go all the way to Deal, and we'll attack there. And he goes, okay, great, sounds good, crack on.
Yeah.
And then the Luftwaffe come in, and Goering sort of goes, oh, don't worry, you don't need any of that. We'll just sort of destroy Britain just with the Luftwaffe itself. And someone says, yeah, but I thought the whole point of the Luftwaffe was it was there to support ground troops. Oh, well, you don't worry about that, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And it's just it's an absolute shower.
Right, and this is the normal thing of Hitler getting people to pick competing claims in as well, because that was his
divide and rule.
Yeah, his management style was to have lots of people all with the same job essentially, who would then compete with each other rather than him.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah,
exactly that. And so anyway, so they go off and do their respective plans, and they haven't got any landing crafts. No one really thought about landing crafts. So they think, okay, so we'll get lots of Rhine river barges, which is not a good thing, because the Rhine river barges are needed on the Rhine to move stuff from A to B.
Clues in the name.
Yeah. So they take them and they kind of build them up in Rotterdam and Dunkirk and Calais and so on. And the RAF regularly go over and bomb them and make life difficult. And they haven't got enough Rhine barges with engines either. So they've sort of go, what are we going to do about that? Because that's a bit of a problem, because you can't sail a barge. I mean, you can't sort of take horses to tow them across the channel. So you go, I know what we'll do. We'll put one in front with an engine and they'll tow the other two. So what actually happens when you're going to land with that?
Well, I mean, the Royal Navy's going to sink it.
It is. And, you know, by the time they're even, you know, by the end of July, they're still not ready. And even by the second, you know, only on 13th of August does Eagle Day start, and they're still some way off. You know, even Hitler realises they've got to destroy the RAF before they can even contemplate doing a cross-channel invasion. So nothing. And by that stage, there's 2.5 million people in, you know, in the army, including, obviously, the Home Guard by this stage. And they're not all Captain Mannering and Private Pike. You know, some of them are actually quite good. And then then there's the army, which is sort of being reconstituted, and the Canadians arriving and all the rest of it. On top of that, there's something like 18 RAF bomber groups, squadrons rather,
Yep.
which are already lined up to drop chemical weapons on any German invasion force. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough, they've also got the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest in the summer of 1940, all congregating in the southeast of England. And we've got superior intelligence. So it's just never,
So what
ever
you're
going to
saying
work.
is it would have been a disaster. I mean, we
Yeah.
could have got there quicker, James, but
Yeah, it's true.
So that's the first half of what was his name? Mark Roberts' question. The second half of his question: would that shorten the war? And I think the answer to that is yes, because Hitler survived. Certainly until Stalingrad, where they switched to total war, and they talk about that. Hitler's surviving on victory. He's surviving on quick and cheap victories, isn't he?
Yes.
So Poland's seen as a quick and cheap victory. You knock Poland over,
Yep.
then you knock France over, and of course Germany only has that option strategically, economically, to do quick knockovers because they haven't got the deep pockets that their opponents have. And if he doesn't get a quick victory in England, the generals may well remove and replace it.
because they nearly do in November 1939.
Yeah.
I mean, the army just generally doesn't like them, and he doesn't like the army, and yeah, as you say, I mean, the victories against France and Low Countries will only go so far.
Right. Okay. So there we are, Mark.
So, yes, we agree
Mark
with you,
Roberts, we agree. Congratulations. We like you because you've made us give a full answer there, and we agree with you. And that's the kind of questions we like on this podcast. Now, this is from Oscar. Do we? I mean, does everyone kind of agree with our analysis there? Do we think that it would have been a disaster, or do you think that because after all, the British Army had folded pretty ignominiously in France? So would the guts have been there for a fight? Do we think? Had the Germans landed? Yes, because it would have been here, wouldn't it? Would have been. Talking to the microphone, James.
Quickly. They did fold quite quickly, but you have to remember that if you're out on a limb, you've got to keep back, retreat with your flanks. It's not the British that are falling back; it's the Belgians and the French.
It's the bloody French. It's the bloody French. James, I'm looking at this map here, and the French have collapsed yet again, and our flank might be turned. We better bugger off through bloody Dunkirk.
There we go. Now, our next one is, this is from Oscar, and from someone who calls himself Simon Shed. I'm sure that's his name. And we're going to tie these two together. He says, German Special Forces, which we did discuss in an earlier podcast.
Yep.
How about Otto Skorzeny? Right? And then Simon Shed says, loving the podcast, which is the only reason I'm reading this out. Is there any truth in the Germans dressed in Allied uniforms or using Allied aircraft during the Ardennes offensive, or is it something from the comic books? So Skorzeny did do that in the Ardennes, didn't he?
Yes.
He had people dressed in American uniforms. They went through the American lines. They caused trouble, didn't they?
Yeah, fortunately for Otto Skorzeny, no one actually saw him, because had they done so, it doesn't matter if you're wearing American kit. No one would have seen through it at all, because, or rather, they would have seen through it completely, because he was very, very tall, had kind of Austrian dueling scars all over his face, and he could be in absolutely nothing but a Nazi. I mean, you can.
He would not have known the password.
No, he wouldn't.
Because wasn't the password Eisenhower's dog or Roosevelt's dog or something?
Yeah, and something, a word that all Germans can't say.
Yeah.
Like ham and jam or something.
Something with a W in it, probably, but we're not going to go there.
So yes, they did. But actually, I am in the archives in the United States. They captured a lot of these guys, and they sentenced them to death. And all their last letters are in a folder. And then they actually commuted the sentences. They didn't shoot them all. Actually, they did shoot some of them. They didn't shoot all of them. And actually, some of them are really, really upsetting, as you would expect. Kind of 19-year-old German lads, or sort of dear parents, I'm got to. Tomorrow I will be dead.
Because you weren't allowed to wear the Geneva Convention says if you're wearing the other side's uniform, you can be shot, can't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they use that against the Great Escapers, don't they? As one of the things they say, you're not in your uniforms, and the Great Escapers tried to say no, these uniforms are made of RAF uniforms repurposed, and the SS or the Gestapo don't care. Guy
Yeah.
Walters knows about that. He's
Yeah,
around
yeah,
here
he
somewhere.
does. I was just about to name check him.
I'm not an expert.
But these letters were really upsetting. I was reading all these letters thinking, oh my God, this is really actually quite gut-wrenching. I feel actually quite sorry for these guys. And then on the last page it said, but we commuted the sentence on most of them.
All right. So
So they got them to write these last letters.
don't feel that sorry for them then, James?
Well, not by the end, no.
Not by the end, okay.
But, I was
enough.
as I was reading them, sort of thing.
But it is because it's in the film, the Battle of the Bulge film, which is like one of the
It's
world's
the worst
worst
ever.
war films
The
ever.
only
made.
good thing about it is it's got Robert Shaw in it.
Yeah, it's so egregious, and it's got Patton tanks as Tiger tanks, which is like probably, if that's the sort of thing that makes your I can't use
Blood boil.
makes blood boil. That's it, or your something else itch. Then it's Patton tanks dressed up as tigers. It's awful. Right, our next question. My friend Simon, this is from Andy in Brum, whose tweet starts, "My friend Simon asked."
Simon can't do it himself.
He can't do it himself.
No, he's not on Twitter and he doesn't like social media.
My friend Simon asked if there was any chance the US would have dropped a nuke in Germany if it had gone badly in the West. Now, of course, he doesn't mean a nuke. He means an atomic weapon, because they weren't nuclear weapons. The atom bombs of the Second World War, were they? Nuclear weapons come later.
Yeah, a little bit later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So this is still atomic bombs like the one they dropped on Hiroshima. This is the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And actually, the Manhattan Project wasn't designed and conceived and put into action to destroy the Japanese. It was to destroy Nazi Germany.
Yeah. So they would have used it.
And it wasn't ready
It wasn't ready, but they would have used it.
because it wasn't ready till July
Right.
1945.
But they would have used it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because some people think, I know, we couldn't possibly have done, but you look at the area bombing that was going on. I mean, Dresden is the equivalent damage of an atom bomb attack.
Yeah, and I
isn't
think the one on Hamburg was.
And
as
Hamburg
well.
definitely is. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Hamburg. More people are killed in Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah than were killed in the Blitz in the UK.
Yes.
In
total.
In total. So
60,000 killed as opposed to 42,000.
in the 3 days in Hamburg. And it's not just it's Bomber Command and the US Air Force, and they get a firestorm started.
Yep.
And
Learning from the lessons of Coventry.
That's right. And one day they actually miss and bomb the docks outside, and they say and the Bomber Command try to say, well, we didn't bomb it for 3 days straight, because they missed it and tried to pass that off as on purpose. But
No, we were really, really tough, ruthless bastards, and
Yeah.
we didn't have any qualms at all about killing vast numbers of civilians.
in Hamburg, in the City Museum, there's a fantastic map they have in the Geschichte Museum in Hamburg, where you turn the dial. And it's a map laid out in front of you, like an enormous table, and you turn the dial, and it starts from Hamburg in AD 30, where they've got the original traces of settlement, and you turn the dial, and it scrolls through history all the way up to today, and they have the 1937 Hamburg map, which is the last time it had been surveyed before the war, and then the next notch is the bombing, and the firestorm. You look at it, and the reality of a Bomber Command sustained offensive 1,000 bomber raid,
3,500 over 3 days.
yeah, exactly.
Heavy bombers.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolutely horrifying, and you really, Goebbels regarded that as a defeat on a parallel with Stalingrad. He said, "We have been defeated in battle here in Hamburg. The Luftwaffe and the home defences have lost here, and the RAF have inflicted and he said if they do this 10 more times this year, we're finished."
Yeah, Albert Speer says exactly the same.
Yeah, and but when you look at that map and you turn the dial, and the extent of the bombing appears on the map, it's absolutely shocking. It's really grim, and obviously the Blitz is an incredibly important part of the way we look at the war. The Blitz here, but when you think of the bombing in Germany, and all right, they started it, but you look at which is sort of the part of the logic. Although British strategic bombers were being ordered and specifications were being laid down in 1937, so we were always going to bomb their cities. We were always planning to do that. It was an extension of the idea of the blockade. It was,
Yeah, but it's also steel, not flesh, as well. It's always
Yeah.
it's also to try and limit the number of people in the coalface of war.
Yeah.
So you use machinery, you use bombers, heavy bombers from the air, so you don't have to have guys beetling around on the ground.
Yeah.
And part of the whole tenet of Bomber Command is that we can win the war by air power alone.
Yeah.
If you just give us enough heavy bombers. And actually, at the end of July 1943, when Operation Gomorrah is carried out, there's a lot of people who are going, you know what, actually,
This
might
might
be right.
work.
This might
Yeah.
just work.
Yeah.
But as with Coventry and as with a lot of these things, there's a lot of things that go in the favour of the attackers on those particular nights. The
Yeah.
wind is just right. They drop just the right space between the two waves and on each night. And on top of that, the fighter defence system isn't very good, and they've introduced window.
That's Window's debut, isn't it?
Yeah,
we all know what window is, right?
The little sort of bits of foil that scramble the radar.
Yeah,
and
good.
And actually, what is also interesting is it gives Bomber Harris of Bomber Command and the Allies a sort of false sense of what can be achieved. And they actually do start, I think they get a little bit complacent. They think, God, we're absolutely got these guys on the run. This is easy peasy. We can do this. One final first. I'll tell you what, let's go to Berlin and really hammer Berlin. And so the Battle of Berlin starts.
Berlin's further away. It's a spread out city. It's not like Hamburg, which has got big warehousing.
And it's not as old as
It's not
Hamburg.
as old. And so they spend several weeks trying to sort of land a killer blow on Berlin and fail.
Yeah, and on top of that, the Luftwaffe completely reorganises its air defence system much more efficiently. So actually, the air defence system over Germany by the end of 1943 is better than the air defence system that we have here in the UK.
Yeah. Well, there we go. I think that's answered his question. Right.
Yeah, that showed him.
Yeah. So we would have nuked the Germans. That's basically what it comes down to.
It's got nothing to do with Hamburg.
But the thing is area bombing. They got it in there, as they called it, dehousing people. They got in their heads that would work. If you can do that, if you can do that with one plane with one bomb, then that really is the machine instead of the flesh doing the job. So it's completely the Allied line of thinking, which is you don't need to spend all these people if you can spend all this money.
Yeah. One of the side products, as well as all this bombing of cities, is that they then clear out all the occupied territories, particularly the lands that they've requisitioned, and particularly properties of Jews. So what the Germans do is they say, well, we've had all our furniture destroyed, so we better get it from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So they clear out all these properties in, like Paris, something like 44,000 properties owned by Jews, and every single one is completely cleaned. And it's not just taking the kind of, the knives and forks and the sofas. It is the helmets, the light bulbs.
It's the lot. Yeah.
The lot. And it's all trained and shipped back to Germany.
There we go. Right. Okay. So Crag now asks, were the barrage balloons really that effective during the war? We know what barrage balloons. I mean, you come to Chalke Valley History Festival. Of course, you know what barrage balloons are. They're those balloons.
They stop a barrage.
That look like that look like
big silver. And
they look like what a kid
bomb.
would draw if they drew a big balloon.
Yeah.
We look with sort of fins, and they're on the end of a rope.
Yeah.
Basically.
And they sort of twinkle in the silvery light.
That's right. But he asks, were they really that effective during the war? Did fighters really need to get that low in order to engage a target? They seem a bit of a waste. Craig seems quite upset about this. They seem a bit of a waste.
And when he says that effective, I mean, what's his bar? I mean, what's effective?
He's not really. I mean, that question's way too vague. Should we even engage that target, James?
I think we can just give it a cursory response. Yeah, I think they were quite
partly
effective.
what they were for is for showing you were doing something air defence wise, because so much of air defence, because after all, air defence was very weirdly organised in the run up to the war. So local councils were in charge of it, and then the government kept trying to prod the local councils, and you had local councils dragging their feet because if they were a Labour council, they'd be pacifist and they wouldn't want to acknowledge there was a possibility or a danger of war, so they wouldn't engage in spending. Also, they didn't want to have to spend money on air defence stuff, where they could spend it on the things they wanted to spend it on. And you get this thing where different London boroughs, particularly in London, different London boroughs are preparing at different rates for the upcoming blitz that they don't know, that they haven't quantified yet. And you've also got the central government thinking, well, London's going to panic and we're going to need troops in London to control the population because they're all going to freak out, because everyone had really taken on Duet's ideas about area bombing, and that what you do is you exert...
Who's this Italian kind of
theorist, military theorist.
Yeah.
And he
late 1920s.
He thought what you do, if you're attacking a democracy, you attack its population, and the population will turn on the government and say, enough's enough, we don't want to fight anymore. And of course, he's been comprehensively proved wrong. I mean, the really interesting thing about bombing is it hardens people's attitudes rather than makes them want to throw in the towel. And but anyway, so you have this very odd thing happening before the war, where all the different, because you've got the local government and then the national government, they're all exerting different pressures in different directions. So barrage balloons are fine.
But on top of that, I mean, I should just say that barrage balloons actually do go quite high. I mean, they can go up. You can have them up at kind of sort of 8,000 feet or something. I mean, they're quite high. And don't forget, at the beginning of the war, no one's got bomb sights. So that if you want to bomb something accurately, you have to get in really low. That's the whole point behind a Stuka.
Yeah.
So it dives down, it terrifies everybody, and it gets in really low, and then it drops its bombs. But it can't do that if it's got a barrage balloon in the way. And similarly, we have them off on the beaches of Omaha and Normandy and Sword and all the rest of it, because the bombs, the threat from the Germans is not from high level. It is from a marauding Junkers 88 coming in nice and low and dropping a bomb from 500 feet.
They get rid of the barrage balloons on the D-Day beaches, don't they? Because the Germans are able to use them
as markers
to sight their artillery to attack the beach, the lodgement.
Yeah.
So
then it's a choice.
So yes.
Which is the greater threat?
Yeah, which is the greater threat. So a couple of weeks into Overlord, they ditched the barrage balloons because the lodgement's so small, actually, that the Germans are able to sight their artillery on the barrage balloons.
I really want some for the Chalke Valley History Festival next year. I've wanted some for years. I just want to put them up. And
not got enough toys here. I mean, look at this, ridiculous.
I know. Well, I want more.
I mean,
so if anyone knows how I can get a barrage balloon or something approximating a barrage balloon, and quite a lot of them over the Chalke Valley History Festival, I'd love to hear from you.
Will that make your fly pasts more difficult? You haven't thought this through.
Oh, that's a point.
By the way...
Well, no, because we're not going to have a fly past here. They come on the hills around.
Okay, well,
and then they can prove the point.
Okay, they can prove the point. By the way, for the listener, because we've got a wonderful audience here, I would say if it was my agent telling me, he'd say there were like 4,000 people here. But it looks to me like there's about 120, 150 people here, and we are sat between a Panzer Mark IV, or if you've got Tiger Panic, it's a Tiger.
Yeah.
Behind it, an M10 Achilles tank destroyer, 17-pounder armed.
Yep.
It's a Sherman chassis, sort of amped. It's sort of Sherman on steroids, basically.
Yeah.
We have a pair of Shermans to our left. What's the lorry, James?
That's a Jimmy. That's a 2.5-ton truck.
Wonderful. We've got some Jeeps. And a steam engine behind us,
and an enormous Typhoon on the hill,
and the world's biggest Typhoon at the top of the hill. For those of you listening on the podcast, right? Now, could you do a feature on your excellent We Have Ways podcast?
You see why we chose Sean.
I like this guy. This is Sean Mackenzie. Could you do a feature on your excellent We Have Ways podcast on the many thousands of men left in France after Dunkirk? Most folk think the story ended there.
Well, I think most folk do think the story ended there, but there wasn't. There was the 1st Armoured Division, which was south of. So what happens is the Germans cut across. They cut across the middle of France, and they cut across through the top of France, and there is this pocket which gets reduced around Dunkirk, and then most of the BF are in that. But there are a couple of units which are not in that northern part of the line, and one of them is the 51st Highland Division, who are holding a bit of the line of the Maginot Line when the Germans attack on the 10th of May, and there is also the 1st Armoured Division. And Churchill's had a lot of stick, the men Churchill left behind and all this sort of, they were abandoned and all the rest of it. Well, absolutely nothing of the sort, because they were still, France was still our ally until they surrendered, and we were still out there, and it was incumbent upon us to try and do our level best. And the 51st Highland Division slotted into a French corps, and it was under the French corps commands, and they were the ones that were deciding when it fell back. Yeah. And they got, unfortunately, and the 7th Panzer Division under Rommel cut in around through this French corps, and the 51st Highland Division were on the coast, and they pulled back to St. Valery, tried to get through to Le Havre and across the River Seine, and they got isolated. Yep. Navy came along to try and rescue them. There was lots of fog, couldn't pick them up. They got put in the sack.
Yep.
But
the thing is, not everyone could get out. My grandfather fought in a town called Hazebrouck. There's a line of towns, there was a chain of towns around sort of 15 miles outside Dunkirk. And the Gloucesters were on the hill at Cassel. Where if you ever go on the Eurostar and you go down to Paris, you look to your left
it's the hill of the Grand Old Duke of York.
Exactly. About 10 minutes into France, you look out and you'll see this very prominent ridge with a windmill on it, and that's Cassel, where the Gloucesters made their last stand. And there's a plaque on the high street there,
and a statue de Foch.
That's right. And then down in Hazebrouck, which is sort of like Leighton Buzzard or somewhere. It's like, or I don't know, an equivalent town round here. Like nowhere to get excited about. But
Dorrington.
But there we are. One for the locals. They fought there, and they made the Bucks Battalion fought the last stand there. My grandfather they'd gone up to the Deal line, so they'd marched up to the Deal line as part of the great plan to stop the Germans on the Deal Canal. Yep. And then when they knew they'd been flanked, they marched back towards Dunkirk, and they got stuck at Hazebrouck. And they were a territorial battalion. He was a stockbroker, and my grandfather was killed at the orphanage in the middle of the town. And there was a dispute about who gave the every man for himself order, or if there was an order. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that history started to sort of reveal itself, because basically all the officers who'd survived since had died, so people were able to tell the truth without wrecking anyone's reputation. And those actions were fought there, and the Germans afterwards said, well, we thought we were up against crack troops, we had no idea you were TA men and all that sort of thing. And I've done the battlefield tour there. In fact, Peter Caddick Adams did that tour with my father about 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's great, right?
And
it's
really, really interesting. And there's the thing where the Royal Artillery, they end up firing over their field guns over open sites at the German tanks to hold the Germans up, and the sappers all drop their shovels and pickaxes and pick up their rifles and fight, and it's all it's heroic last stand stuff, but because of them,
many more managed to get away.
Because
you're holding this loose perimeter. It's sort of like a sort of lozenge shape that's sticking out into northern France from Dunkirk, and it's folding in on itself as they're moving back. So the ones furthest to the east are folding in towards Dunkirk.
Yeah.
But there's this rough perimeter which is being sort of held together along this sort of river line, and there's the canal line, isn't there? And Cassel, as you're saying.
Yeah, the Germans tried to bypass Cassel because it's on a hill. There's no
and
point.
It's a great. I mean, there's lots of great sacrificial stands. There's an amazing one that Alan Adair recounts.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, it's the first Grenadier Guards, and they come back on the D plan. They then come back to the Escaut, which has been straightened into a sort of long canal, and they have this incredible fight on the Escaut where lots of their officers killed. So Major Alan Adair is acting battalion commander, and they are resting up at Plug Street, the old Plug Street from the Ypres salient. And they're resting, having been given orders to go to Dunkirk. And a young subaltern turns up and reporting from Alexander's Corps headquarters. And Adair says to him, "How wonderful to see the commanding officer of my battalion from 1917. And he says, it's exactly the same place. And the chap says, "Well, I'm awfully sorry, sir, but we actually now need you to attack the Ypres Camille Canal." And he goes, "Consider it done." And off they go and probably get completely slaughtered. Again, I mean, it's this amazing sacrifice that happens. I mean, it is a myth that the BEF fight poorly.
No, yes, it is a myth, yes. But it's because the bloody French flank collapses,
old boy.
Right, okay, we're going to take a short break now, but in the meantime, a quick straw poll from our audience of thousands here at the Chalke Valley History Festival. In a moment, if you think Monty was a brilliant general, shout "Yah!" Right? So if you think he was a brilliant general, shout "Yah!"
Yeah.
If you think he was an overrated egotist, shout 9. The Yahs have it. Excellent. Superb.
Good.
We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to part 2 of our live We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast. With me, Murray and James Holland, whose hat's that's a more expensive hat than this one.
Yeah, this is an Akubra, actually.
It's an Akubra. Wonderful.
Which is it's a
Australian.
Yeah, but
hat.
It's the creme de la creme of felt World War
It's
II.
the creme de la creme of felt World War II hats.
Yeah, definitely.
There's the claim on that.
Look at yours. I mean, I'm glad you're wearing an England cap. But
Well, yeah, it's more out of mourning than...
don't
Yeah,
go there.
anyway,
Don't
right,
go there.
now, yes, folks, it's the World War II podcast live from a field in Wiltshire. Now, we want to take questions from our wonderful audience here. I will come amongst you, so to speak.
You've got one over there.
We got there's a question here for the gentleman here. Right, wonderful. And a T-shirt. What's your name, sir?
Bill Chorley.
Bill Chorley. What's your question, Bill?
My question to you both, you were talking about Harris and his single-mindedness in the bombing campaign. What might be your opinion of his of Sir Richard Pearce, whose time in Bomber Command came to rather an unfortunate end?
Oh, right. So Richard Pearce.
Yes, he later went
Thank
on
you.
to
Excellent
Southeast
question.
Asia Command.
Yeah.
Well, Richard Pearce did come. I mean, Bomber Command in the first part of the war is not an edifying story. I mean, they one of the first people to fly, I think, on the 3rd of September is Guy Gibson when he's in his Hampton, and they go off and they're going to attack the fleet at Wilhelmshaven. They get shot at a little bit. I think the weather closes in, and then they shoot back again. And then for the next few months, all they do is drop leaflets.
Yeah.
They don't have any bombs at all.
Well, because there's cabinet level discussions about whether damaging German private property will affect the war effort.
Yes, there is that, and then all the sort of deliberations between the British and the French about what to do. You know, do you go and sort of bomb the Rhine river barges, or do you go up to Sweden, or attack their iron ore fields, or what do you do, or do you just go for it and bomb Germany? The French are like, absolutely no way you're going to bomb Germany, because the last thing we want is them coming back and bombing us.
Yeah.
So it's not until I think the 17th of May that the first bomber command attack takes place on actual over German soil, and then they continue. But of course the problem is that they're just not very accurate, and they haven't got very big bombers at that time in the early part of the war, and it's just not really achieving very much. Although it has to be said that of course Bomber Command attacks Berlin 4 times before the Luftwaffe attacks London.
Yeah.
And that is to kind of try and distract them, really, and show that they can do it and they can reach it. But then there is the terrible Butt report of the summer of 1941, where some investigations are done, analysis is done on the actual bombing, and basically it shows that kind of
Can't hit a thing.
Can't hit a thing, and it is really the nadir of Bomber Command, and it is in the kind of sort of fallout of the Butt report that Pearce gets the
Pearce
tic-tac.
is fired.
Pearce is fired, and also Ludlow.
But you have
Hewitt.
something to add, sir.
Quite frankly, I think Pearce got rather the bad end of a stick, because when Pearce took over from Portal, he had his various directives handed down as to what to do, and then they kept shifting the goalposts, as one might say. And so he would start with, he had some very successful raids on Wilhelmshaven in Bremen at the early part of 1941, and then of course he's told to go and bomb ships in Brest. And in my opinion, Pearce really had quite a rough deal at the end of the day. Certainly Churchill put him in his place at the end and said, you've got to go. But I think Pearce really...
Well, I've got to say, Bill, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, the problem is that Bomber Command is just not equipped in the first part of the war to do what it needs to do. And it is a harsh reality that when public opinion is turning against you, you've got to do something about it, and that is nearly always the commander. And Pearce is not the first person to be given the tic-tac without kind of necessarily particularly deserving it. But actually he does get, he gets elevated, and at the end he's the head of RAF in Southeast Asia Command and goes up a couple of notches in terms of rank. He ends the war with his reputation intact.
Brilliant.
I'd say.
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So this
Thank
next
you.
question better be good. The gentleman here in the flip-flops, it's your decision. What's your name, my friend?
Mike Armstrong, loving the podcast, by the way.
Oh, right, you can ask a question then. What's your question, Mike Armstrong?
Contrary to popular mythology, how effective really was SOE and the French resistance in the lead up to D-Day?
I think
here we
this
go.
is a reference to Sir Max, and I think, and his recent book where basically he said it was a complete waste of time, and all it did was lead to the deaths of lots of Frenchmen. My view is that, broadly speaking, it was pretty successful, and certainly resistance in the lead up to D-Day was incredibly successful. I mean, we got a huge amount of intelligence about all the kind of layout of Normandy, where enemy positions were, which was, because it's not just about RAF Medmenham and taking over, photo reconnaissance planes coming over. It is, and this is where Allied intelligence really works, it is when you put it all together that it's really, really effective, and it adds up more than... Oh, God, I've got this individual sum thing again. Do you remember the other day? I couldn't get it right.
Sum of all its parts.
Yes, that's the one. Anyway, yeah, so it's when you
More
put...
than the sum of its parts.
it adds up to more than the sum of its individual parts.
Yeah, there we are.
That's the one. That's the one.
Hang on.
In a book a couple of years ago by Paddy Ashdown, he painted a picture of a lot of fiefdoms inside the French resistance, a lot of collaboration with the German Gestapo in France. So, notwithstanding D-Day, and the investment going in by the Special Operations Executive. How effective was the French resistance?
Well, I think the thing is France politically is crazy paving. Certainly in the run up to even 1940, French politics is incredibly fractured. You've got people who, Vichy doesn't happen out of nowhere. Vichy is a counter-revolutionary political movement within France, where they aren't interested in fraternity, equality, and the other one, liberty. That's it. Yeah, they're not interested in those things, and it's a deliberate and willing pushback against that. There's this idea.
Well, what happens, of course, is when you've got sort of fractious politics and no one can agree on anything, and the kind of normal parliamentary system of democracy seems to be failing, then you get more extremes of politics, and it moves from the centre ground to the extremes of right or left, and that was exactly what was happening in France.
Yeah, and also you've got France having to cope with the fact it lost so quickly to the Germans, and is that the sign of its own moral decay and all that sort of thing. So you've got communists, you've got all sorts of different people, and the communists have been answering to Moscow anyway as part of the Comintern. So it's all very complicated, and you've got people who've come out of Spain, out of the Spanish Civil War, Basque people, all sorts of in the south of France, all sorts of different elements. And who's that?
Just look,
Oh, crikey! Yes, we have the
Luftwaffe.
Luftwaffe are here.
A
ladies and
Luftwaffe
gentlemen.
general.
Stood next to the Mark IV. Anyway, the point is by 1944 the French resistance is effective because they could see the tide had turned, and and
they're just better organised.
They're better organised.
I mean, it takes time, because if you're going to resist, you've got to have hope. And when there's no hope, and at the start of the war you've got complete clampdown on the press, it's very hard to organise yourself. You don't have mobile phones, you don't have WhatsApp groups or anything like that in which you can organise yourself. So how do you actually, it is necessarily fractured, and it takes time to kind of organise everyone and get everyone together. And then, of course, you've got to feel that the tide has turned, that laying your life on the line is worth the risk, because ultimately we might be able to turn out the filthy Bosch and all the rest of it, and overthrow Vichy, which is now proven to be failing. And so it takes time to get to that position. And it also takes time for the Allies and the Free French back in Algiers or back in London to work out how they can best support it. I mean, of course, there are failures of SOE and those agents, but actually it's a real pain for the Germans having, constantly divert so much resources to squirreling out these people, and actually, look at Das Reich moving up to the Normandy battlefront. I mean, they have an absolute shocker. I think is it Hounsworth or Bullbasket? I can't remember. One of the SAS things. They find out from the French resistance there's a huge load of oil wagons just in a railway siding south of Limoges. The SAS call in the mosquitoes from the RAF. They come over, blow it all up. That was the fuel that was supposed to be for Das Reich. They get really cross, go in and shoot up Oradour. And of course that's horrific and terrible, and there's a huge loss of life, but there is absolutely no question that those resistance activities really, really slow the advance of Das Reich up to the front. I don't think they get up there till kind of middle of July or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's too late by then. And that massively helps the Allies in their battle in Normandy. I think Max is wrong on this one.
Hey, Max, oh, crikey. It's
He's
historian
a lovely
historian
bloke.
action.
I'm a big fan of
the
his.
The gentleman here in the hat, we have a question. Oh, it's a Dax over Normandy shirt. Fantastic.
Hi, Al.
What's your name?
Mark Roberts, but not the one who asked you first.
Another
question.
Mark Roberts.
Yes. What I was going to say is breaking the Enigma code of the Ultra and breaking the German codes gave us a major advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. When it came to D-Day, Normandy, and especially things like Market Garden, was that decoding as important? Did we make the most of it?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. Well, sometimes the Ultra does work against us, it has to be said, and one of the classic examples of that is Italy, where we go into Italy on the assumption from an Ultra decrypt that Hitler is going to retreat the German forces to the Pisa-Rimini line, which is well north of Rome, so it's going to be a nice, easy victory, major European capital by Christmas, hooray, all round. And then he changes his mind. And actually that does happen quite a lot of times.
Ultra's beguiling, though, isn't it? Because I got into a row on Twitter with someone about this who said, we knew when every German general was going to the toilet, we knew absolutely everything about them, that's why we beat them. But Ultra's just a part of the picture, the SIGINT picture, and you've got lots of other intelligence, and everything needs to cross-reference. the pattern's always changing. You know, it is important. I mean, Arnhem's a really good case in point about the intelligence picture, because there's a whole set of quite interesting, and the word is myths, about the intelligence around Ultra and the photo reconnaissance intelligence that leads to the Arnhem plan. And a lot of what you may have, a lot of what people have got as a received opinion on that is being picked apart at the moment. For instance, the famous overflights that supposedly saw the German the tanks in Arnhem, those overflights can't be found, and the RAF logs reveal no such overflights. So it looks like the guy who pushed that story in the 50s and 60s, who's the intelligence officer in the movie who's called Brian Urquhart, and of course he's confusingly called Urquhart, and you have the General Urquhart. So they change his name, Roy, and they change his name in the movie, and they're making that sort of nervy chap going, "Sir, I'm awfully worried about this German tanks seem to be around Arnhem."
Nonsense, man.
Exactly that. Yeah. But those overflights don't exist. They're not anywhere. There aren't any pictures of Panzers in Arnhem. So the intelligence picture isn't just Ultra. It's all sorts of other things. And you know, in the end, like James says, you can look at the intelligence picture and make a wrong decision just as much as a right one based on what you think you know. I mean, it's Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and unknown knowns and all that stuff. But Ultra's important. But I often think people think it means we knew everything, and we certainly didn't. An awful lot of it is you know, that thing of fighting patrols and capturing people on front lines and bringing them in and interrogating them. Because, for instance, in Kursk, the Russians knew perfectly well what the Germans are up to, because they just listened to their radio traffic. They didn't bother. They didn't need the Ultra that they were getting from Bletchley, that had been stolen from Bletchley by Shawcross. They didn't need that stuff, because and they were capturing Germans and saying, well, when's the offensive? And they'd tell them. And there's all that going on as well, that churn of intelligence that, aside, because we like Ultra because it's the computers and it's Bletchley Park and it's Alan Turing and
it's also this whole thing that kind of the unsung heroes as well, and that they weren't given proper credit until 1974 and Frank Winterbottom and all the rest of it. Yeah. But actually, I think we've gone a little bit too far the other way now.
Yeah. Another question. That was a good question, though. Should we? We'll get a T-shirt on you. Let's see. What's your name, my friend?
I'll give it away. My name's Dan. I wanted to know. I've just finished Geoffrey Whelham's book, and the amount of hours flying time he had before he was basically thrust into battle against the Luftwaffe, who were known for being hundreds and hundreds of hours. Etc. I just wonder, is it a result of the whole war effort and the supplying of the front line and the industry that went on back in England that made them better, that gave them that superiority?
I think there's a fundamental flaw in your point, in that you're assuming that the Luftwaffe are better trained than the RAF, and I don't think they were. What you had in the RAF fighter command was people who'd been flying since before the war and had quite a lot of experience. They'd flown in France and stuff, so they knew the kind of, they built up their hours and all the rest of it. Exactly the same in the Luftwaffe. You had people who'd flown in Spain, who'd flown in Poland, but you also had plenty of new guys as well. And a new pilot, whether they be Luftwaffe or whether they be British, had about 150 to 170 hours. That didn't change at all in the Battle of Britain. And in actual fact, the only period where they're really, really stretched is from Eagle Day on the 13th of August to the 7th of September, which is when they're kind of cutting corners a little bit on the operational training units. There's absolutely no cut or compromise at all on the main body of the training. It is just on that training on types. When you're converting, you've got your wings, you've passed out, you've got your degree, effectively. You're now going for a sort of bit of polish, and that's where you learn to fly your Spitfires and Hurricanes at your OTU. And that is the only bit that is changed. And it is reduced, but from the 7th of September, Keith Park introduces the squadron classification scheme of putting them A, B and C. And what tends to happen, if you're new and a bit short of training, you go into a C-level squadron, which might be in sort of Acklington or somewhere in Northumberland, where you're not going to have an awful lot of action. Occasionally a lone Ju-88 comes over from Stavanger and you all take off and you get a bit of action, but you can build up your as, and you can build up the as in your logbook, build up as on type. There's 3 or 4 experienced guys in the squadron to show you the ropes. That's just hugely successful. The Luftwaffe haven't done anything like that, and certainly by the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, you've got pilots. There is not a single British, a single RAF or American pilot that isn't arriving at frontline squadron with at least 350 hours, whereas for the Luftwaffe that's now down to about 90 or 100. So I don't, Jeff's book is totally, utterly brilliant, and he was a really good mate of mine. I thought he was absolutely fantastic. But you've got to remember that book was written in the 1970s, and it was written from the perspective of an 18-year-old flying in the Battle of Britain who knew diddly squat about what was going on. So what he's coming at is, oh my God, we're coming up against the Luftwaffe. There's just me and Brian King come against 200, or there's me and 11 other guys against 300 Luftwaffe. He can't possibly see that bigger picture. I mean, it is really interesting on Battle of Britain Day, 15th September 1940. The biggest raid of the day kind of focuses around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, southeast London. There are 300 Luftwaffe aircraft in the skies. There are 335 British fighter planes. So they don't have an advantage at all. It's just that when you're one of 12, you're one of 12 attacking 300, but in the whole, there's 335 of you. But someone like Jeff, aged 18, isn't going to know that. So it gives a kind of warped, distorted view. Actually, we were much better trained and equipped than the narrative myth would have us believe.
I agree with James. Don't really know anything about that. Right, okay.
What is this lad here?
Oh, okay.
He's had his hand up since the beginning.
Young lad here. What's your name, mate?
Aidan.
Hello, Aidan. What's your question for James? Well, probably James. I'll chip in.
Who was the better general, Montgomery or Slim?
Oh. Wow.
What?
A bigger general.
Well, obviously.
Different theatres, different people.
Horses for courses.
Yeah. The thing about Slim is that if you accept that war is fought on 3 levels, the strategic level, big overview, operational level, how you kind of you organise your chain of supplies and all the rest of it, and the tactical level, the kind of the coal face of fighting, I do think Slim has a very, very complete grasp on the whole thing. If I was to criticise Monty, I would say strategically he's got the big picture. Operationally, he's 100% got the big picture. Tactically, I think you can argue that he's not necessarily the most dynamic at the time, but at the time that he's really coming to the fore, you don't really need that. I mean, I think you can say his fire plan at Alamein, you could criticise that a little bit if you wanted to. Whereas I don't think you can really criticise Slim in the later part of the war, but in the first part of the war, when he's in East Africa, for example, he actually makes some quite bad mistakes, but he learns.
I'd say they're neck and neck. Myself, it's very, very difficult to choose. Montgomery has attracted much more criticism than Slim. I don't think Slim has ever had the sort of acid bath treatment that Monty's had,
except in Canberra.
Well, except in Canberra, for different things in a different decade for different reasons.
Yeah.
But what he's not had is his reputation endlessly compared to other generals, competing generals, lots of angry American memoirs written about him and all that sort of thing. He's never had that bad press that Montgomery attracted. Why that is, I don't think that's because he's an unimpeachable general, though. I think it's just because that theatre there is what you've got in Normandy is you've got competing armies, and you've got the thing that eventually the Americans become preponderant in Europe. They have to. They always were going to, and so you've got the politics of how you manage the Americans and the British together, and the Americans then, in the end, the Americans have to run the show. So in the end, they're gonna say some mean stuff about Monty, and you've not got that happening in Burma. It's just Slim on his own.
And there is a moment in the Battle of Imphal which is, has been voted by the National Army Museum as Britain's greatest ever battle, there is a moment where Slim completely misreads the Japanese intentions, and had it not been for the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade, as we discussed in an earlier podcast, that whole thing might have really gone pear-shaped. And then we might not be saying, oh, Slim, isn't he wonderful, because he'd have been sacked and someone else replaced him and he'd probably been completely forgotten.
There we go. So, in conclusion, Monty. Right. We have another question for the young lad here as well. It's great. I believe the children of the future, ladies and gentlemen. And what's your name, sir?
Fred.
Fantastic, old school. What? I was going to say, what do you do for a living, Fred? But it's not my matinee yet. What's your question, Frederick?
Why didn't the Germans invade Malta?
Try again.
Why didn't the Germans invade Malta?
Why didn't the Germans invade Malta? Now, the thing is, Fred, if only we had someone with us who'd written a book about Malta.
Well,
James, any idea? Because they couldn't is I think what it boils down to. Too tough a nut to crack.
Well, the moment of opportunities really is in the first half of 1941, not 1942, really. And then it's a straight choice between kind of Crete or Malta, and Hitler goes for Crete because he's absolutely obsessed with securing his oil fields in Romania. And Crete is perceived to be a place where the RAF can make a base and from which they could attack his only oil source in Ploesti in Romania. So they go for Crete for kind of, it's still absolutely insane decision in May 1941.
Taking islands is really difficult, isn't it?
Taking islands is incredibly difficult.
The British are messing it up in 1944 still. You've got
and the Dodecanese.
The Dodecanese, all these terrible operations that go really badly wrong.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's incredibly hard. And actually, when you go to Malta, it's a very, very difficult place to attack because it's very craggy. It hasn't got any beaches or anything. It's got a couple, but not that you could really base an invasion upon. So you'd have to have an amphibious invasion supported by an airborne force. And don't forget, there's vast numbers of anti-aircraft guns on Malta by the beginning of 1942, all of which will make any airborne invasion very, very precarious. And because they lose so many airborne forces in in Crete in May 1941, Hitler goes, right, you know what, it's just not worth the sacrifice. These are amongst our very best trained troops and they're getting slaughtered every time they jump out of an aircraft. Let's just not bother and use them as sort of specialist ground forces instead. And the Italians are very keen on getting Malta because they completely understand in a way that the Germans don't that the sea lanes across the Mediterranean are their key to what's going on in North Africa. Hitler doesn't really get that because he's a continentalist landlubber, and so he kind of fails to completely see the strategic importance of an island like Malta. And so he holds the ace card and he says, no, I don't really fancy it. And so the Italians aren't going to do it on their own because they're just not strong enough militarily to do it, and it just fizzles away.
There you go, Fred. Now we have something to give away, don't we? We have a jacket to give away. I think what was the requirement they had?
It's an M43, and they had to say something like #We Have Ways and we'll see you there or something.
Yeah, I'll be there.
I'll be there. That was it.
So we have a helmet, as ever. This isn't a puns show, so I'd like someone to reach into the helmet for me, so to speak. Behave yourselves. It's a history festival. The lady here, would you like to pick a name out of our helmet, please?
It's actually quite a significant helmet because it's a helmet of the US 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One.
Okay, so we have a winner. Thank you, madam. It's
Andrew Wycherley.
Andrew Wycherley, where are you? There, come on.
Andrew Wycherley.
Round of applause for Andrew. Have we got the jacket?
No, we haven't got it. So I'm going to have to send it to you, but we'll send it to you. We'll sign it and put it in the post.
Team here. Yeah, here we go. Harry will.
And it should fit you like a glove.
There we go. Yes, it is one size fits all, fortunately. Right. Well, I think that is it from us.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much for coming and listening to this live from a field podcast here at the Chalke Valley History Festival. This is James Holland, ladies and gentlemen.
And this is Mr. Al Murray.
Thanks for coming. See you again soon.
Cheerio.
Monty, definitely Monty.